It's great to welcome to the program today Tess Wilkinson-Ryan, who's a moral psychologist and a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and also author of the recently released book, Foolproof: How Fear of Playing the Sucker Shapes Ourselves and the Social Order and What We Can Do About It. Really great having you on today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to start with, let's talk maybe about what is the sucker construct or that idea that you talk about and elaborate in the book.
Yeah, the sucker construct is the idea that there are a whole bunch of interactions or sort of dynamics, transactions in our everyday lives that take the shape or can take the shape of a scam, that feel like, wait a minute, I have a concern here that I'm about to, I'm about to sort of voluntarily enter into something that's going to leave me holding the bag. It's going to leave me with some unfair, bad result, thus making me a sucker. And the reason for thinking about this as a construct is that it can sort of be overlaid on a variety of situations. It's not always obvious that you have like a Ponzi scheme going on.
What sorts of situations that might not be obvious, right? Like outside of actual Ponzi schemes, would this be relevant?
Yeah, I think probably some of the ones that are like most intuitive are cases where you've gone to buy something and the price is higher than you thought it should be. So I give an example in the book of my sister going to buy a Gatorade from a place that she just realized when she went in was a tourist trap and sort of had this moment of being like, I'm not one of these people who pays $6 for Gatorade, but she was like actually really thirsty and actually needed to get a Gatorade ASAP. And she realized, wait, what am I doing? There's no reason for me to think I'm a sucker here. I just need to buy this drink and move along. Other situations that come up in everyday life would be like deciding whether or not to believe somebody who's giving you an excuse for something. Deciding whether or not to let someone cut in front of you in traffic. I think there's a lot of these little dynamics where people sort of get their hackles up and think like, what does it make me if I let you, whatever, zoom down the breakdown lane and then pop in front of me on the highway?
And one of the arguments that you make, and that seems quite reasonable, is that this fear of being the sucker impacts personal choices, where if we had maybe a more default belief that getting suckered wasn't a possibility, we would behave differently than having this sort of guard up. What are the sorts of personal choices that people would make based on this fear of being suckered?
Yeah, maybe I can give two examples from two different sort of sides of the kinds of decisions you might make. So I think about this as impacting decisions that are about like getting ahead, and then impacting decisions that are more like other regarding. So how you sort of do good rather than or sort of how you be good in the world, I guess. So one example would be, say, personal investing. So there's actually a really nice study that sort of asks people in two different conditions of an experiment, how much money would you invest in this company if I gave you the stats of this company? And the stats of the company are either, look, there's an 80% chance that investors break even, 15% chance that investors double their money, or a 5% chance that they lose it all. And the 5% chance was described to half the subject as a 5% chance that the founders of the company they'd overestimated consumer demand. They made a mistake.
Honest mistake.
Honest mistake, exactly.
Yeah.
So you can see where it's going, right? So the other half of the subjects are told there's a 5%, that 5% chance, that 5% downside risk, that's the risk that these guys are frauds. And, the numbers there are the same. In both cases, there's a 95% chance of breaking even or doing better than breaking even, but people had really different responses to what to do in those situations. People were way less willing to invest in the maybe fraud situation, even though it was only a 5% risk.
I guess the difference, if you wanted to argue that there is some logic to that difference, would be, well, if they are frauds, then we're definitely not getting our return. Whereas if they're wrong, we might just get a different return, or market conditions might change. Or, I mean, I get like it's set up in a way where you're trying to eliminate that, but there would be some argument like that, I guess.
No, and I think that what you're describing is actually exactly how this works psychologically. Like, I think you're exactly right to think that the way it works is that once you invoke the fraud possibility, people basically have a whole bunch of ways that sort of fraud reasoning affects the way they think about the numbers, right? They think, well, the fraud number is really bad. That one's serious. The other number doesn't feel as serious for the
Right.
kinds of reasons that you describe. And you can think about the ideas like how prone are people to fighting the hypo, right? They're sort of like what's happening is that you're sort of resisting the math, which is, I think, exactly what people are doing in the real world, saying, well, wait, the math doesn't feel as bad to me.
Right.
And part of the argument is like, that's exactly the point. The math feels worse once you invoke the possibility of a scam.
Rather than just a mistake. Yeah, that's an interesting
That's,
one. What was the other example from a different area?
Yeah, the other example is, which I think that that a lot of people find pretty intuitive, is that people can get really nervous or wary about feeling like a sucker when they start to get when they're engaging in basically like a charitable transaction. So if you've ever heard people sort of resisting donating money or resisting even giving money to somebody who's asking for money on the street, for example, and they say,
Yes.
well, what are they going to spend it on? Right? And there's this sort of, what does it make me if they're going to spend this money on something that I don't approve of, right? That's sort of a consistent fear. And there's a whole bunch of there's a whole bunch of pleas, for example, from food banks.
Yes.
And the food banks say, we really appreciate donations, but please donate cash.
Mm.
Cash is what we need because we know what the needs are of the people who we're serving. We don't pay retail prices, right? We pay wholesale prices, and we can buy things in bulk. And a lot of people really resist donating cash. It's a lot easier, I think, to do a charity drive where you're asking for in-kind donations, toys, coats, food, cans of canned goods rather than cash. And there's some really interesting studies that suggest that people basically feel like, well, cash is so easy to abuse. Cash is going to, if I give cash, I have to be worried what people are going to do with it. Whereas if I give a can of beans,
there's only so many things you can do with that. Yeah.
Exactly. It's kind of exploitation proof, right?
Yeah.
But, right. So it's sort of exploitation proof. And I know I can see how people can sort of justify that in their minds, like what's going on there. But actually, for any individual, if I was going to donate, let's say food to a food drive, for me to get into my car,
right,
and drive to a store and pay retail prices for a bunch of rice and beans and then to bring them to the food bank is actually a huge waste of time and money. And for all I know, they need baby formula, right? Not rice and beans. And so it's actually a way of making this donation way less valuable and way more costly for me.
When it comes to, we're sort of kind of getting into some stereotyping of like, what would the folks who are on the receiving end be likely to do if they received A versus B? Can you talk a little more generally about how stereotyping plays a role in the sucker construct?
Yeah, I think it plays a really underappreciated role. Or I should say, actually, maybe I want to flip the question a little bit and argue that the ideas we have and the fears we have about playing the sucker are actually constitutive of a lot of intergroup stereotypes, of a lot of the most pernicious sort of avenues of bias in the culture. So if you think so the example I've raised about the donations, this is a place where I think a lot of people can see that we live in a society where there are stereotypes, for example, about people living in poverty. Right? That actually what they're doing is taking your taxpayer dollars and using them to avoid entering the workforce. Those kinds of stereotypes are leveraged to basically reduce solidarity, I would say, right? To sort of like to come between people who want to do the compassionate thing and the compassionate or the sensible or the humane or however you want to describe it, to come between them and that instinct and sort of create rifts between people.
And it does seem to follow from that belief that if you believe that, you would say, well, by donating the cans rather than the money, exactly, I am acting logically based on this stereotype about the group that would receive it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's sort of exactly where people go. The more suspicious you are of the people to whom you are donating goods or money, right? the more you'll go out of your way to only make a very particular kind of donation. I mean, and I would sort of still argue that is still sort of at its core an inefficient donation, in part because there's not actually. I mean, in part because the stereotype content is, we don't have reason to believe it's true, right? I think it's bringing in a bunch of sort of pernicious classism, basically.
When we think about different types of, so, there's like hustles, scams, Ponzi schemes, business practices to some degree. We were recently talking about the FTC now is looking at passing a law that says you have to be able to cancel a gym membership in the same way that you sign up for it, right? So it can't be you sign up in 30 seconds online, but then you've got to go in person with a notarized form in order to cancel it. If that's how you have to cancel it, then you've got to sign up that way, which would never happen because the whole point is reduce friction for the sign up, increase friction for the cancellation. That's like a business practice, which you can argue is a sort of hustle or scam, but people's sort of resistance to it is very different than someone on the street asking for money. What's happening psychologically there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I should say that the gym example is like very close to my heart, in part because my day job, I'm teaching contracts, and so a lot of my research is about consumer contracts and the way people interact with this whole world of sort of clicking to agree.
Yeah.
And one of my deep concerns about the way that consumer contracts operate in the world is that people do feel like they are bound to these deals and sort of don't perceive them as exploitation in the way that you might expect, given how hard it is to get out of your gym membership,
right?
That kind of thing. So part of the argument that you're picking up on is the argument that it feels worse to be taken advantage of by someone who you thought was your subordinate or peer than someone who you already assumed had a bunch of power. So if you think that a scam is a power play, and I think it is. I think it's right. There's a lot of that it's about power in part, right? If you feel like you've been scammed, one of the experiences you have is a feeling sort of foolish and humiliated, right? It's sort of a low stat. It's a lowering of your sense of like what my belonging in this group, my sense of dignity and belonging, right? Okay. Being able to be made to feel that way by someone who you already assumed had power, or you feel less acutely if it's coming from someone who you already thought was sort of making the world go round. Whereas if you think about it as people who you thought were, who you assumed were sort of in positions of less power than you, then it feels like you've been kicked down further on the sort of social ladder in ways that feel really terrible, right? In ways that feel like destabilizing. Like, what is my sense of status and belonging in this community?
That's interesting. And that, when I think about $35 overdraft fees on a checking account, which might add up to $500 versus someone suckered you out of $500 worth of Bitcoin. The latter is sort of someone just like you who figured out a way to get $500 in Bitcoin from you versus something that seems more systematic and sort of like a business-oriented transaction where you could argue, I mean, I'm not saying that you're told the overdraft fees up front. Like, I understand that it's not exactly the same, but the feeling would come away being dramatically different.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people feel like there's a theory in psychology that I like a lot called system justification, and it's just the idea basically is people are sort of motivated to explain that the system works, right? So you're motivated to say like, well, the banks have to make their money somehow, and I knew, I was alerted beforehand that I was going to hit the overdraft fee, even though just to be clear, my argument is like, no, that's deeply problematic. Like, in fact, nobody can read all these terms and conditions. It's right. This is having all of these sort of fines and fees be associated with this sort of culture of scolding people about reading the fine print. I think is super cynical.
Yeah.
But I think you're right that when it comes from as you say, like a peer, like someone who's sort of like leveraged their position to get one over on you, even though you're both just people out there in the crypto world, it feels like, I've been like, have been like demoted in this social world.
Last thing I want to ask you about, in terms of like foolproofing ourselves so that we can't be scammed, In specific areas, you can always find tips. When it comes to those phishing emails, here's the way that you handle that. When you go to buy a car, don't let them make the conversation about your monthly payment. Like, first talk about the sale price, then deal with fine. You know, there's within specific areas, there's all these ideas. Are there more overarching principles, or are they really the types of principles that lend themselves to paranoia and are less useful, practically speaking?
Yeah. You know, in some ways I have like this deeply unsatisfying answer to that question, which is kind of like that part of my view is to surrender more often, to let it be that there are more cases in which you have thought through what would the consequences in this case be of being sort of a little bit duped or scammed or whatever. And if they aren't that big, to just let it go. So I think the context that you're describing, like buying a car, that's exactly the kind of context where you want to be really have your antennae up, right? You want to be like especially wary.
The stakes are certainly higher.
The stakes are high, and you know the only goal is to get out of there with a car that you can afford. It's not like you don't have a goal of like making friends with the salesperson.
Right.
But there are all these other contexts in life where you can sort of get this kind of sucker prickle at the back, you know, like oh, is this going to happen to me? That happened. I mean, so for example, in the life of a teacher, that's me, right? In your life as a parent, as a friend, where you start to get that little prickle, and it really helps to think, well, wait a minute. What actually is the risk here? How big of a deal would it be if I gave a student an extension on a paper that they didn't technically need for the reason they said they need it, right? That would probably be to me a small deal. By contrast, it would feel like a really big deal if I treated a student callously who actually needed my help. Right? It's about like weighing the real risks, in sort of going back to that investment example, right? Of like asking yourself to talk through the math a little bit to say, is it right? Do I really think that my sort of focus on this, you know, risk of a fraudster is something that I believe in some deeper way? Or is this a little mistake I'm making, a sort of a way my attention's been torn away from the place where it really belongs?
Yeah, and the example about the paper and the extension also relates to an asymmetry in if I'm correctly assessing versus incorrectly assessing, and that certainly can be a big factor as well. The book is Foolproof: How Fear of Playing the Sucker Shapes Ourselves and the Social Order and What We Can Do About It. We've been speaking with the book's author, Professor Tess Wilkinson-Ryan. Really appreciate your time and your insights today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.